A storage room at the Smithsonian has spent over a century quietly hiding a lock of human hair that once belonged to a murdered war chief, filed away and forgotten, waiting to blow apart where his entire people say they were born. Everyone assumes the Black Hills have always belonged to the Sioux. That assumption is wrong. For 100 years, the Smithsonian held that stolen piece of his body without ever fully accounting for how it got there or what it would eventually prove. Ernie LaPointe spent his whole life insisting he was Sitting Bull's last living descendant, with nothing but family memory and a paper trail to back him up. In 2021, a laboratory at Cambridge finally settled who he was. It also opened a question nobody official wanted asked. Sitting Bull died on December 15, 1890, shot during a botched arrest at his cabin on the Standing Rock Reservation in the Dakotas. By then, he was already one of the most feared and respected men on the continent, a Hunkpapa Lakota holy man who had reportedly seen soldiers falling into his camp during a Sundance vision, days before his warriors and their allies wiped out Custer's column at Little Bighorn in 1876. The United States government spent the next 14 years trying to neutralize him, chasing him into Canada, jailing him, touring him with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show for a single season in 1885, where paying crowds lined up to see, in the flesh, the man they had been told to fear most, watching him from a distance as the ghost dance movement swept across the plains that final winter, a spiritual movement promising the return of the buffalo and the vanished dead if the old ceremonies were danced back into being. Indian agents panicked. Officials decided, wrongly or not, that Sitting Bull was about to lead an uprising and sent police to arrest him before dawn. Killing him didn't end the story. It just changed what got taken from him. 2 weeks later, on December 29th, soldiers of the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, surrounded a band of Lakota at Wounded Knee Creek, not far from where Sitting Bull had lived, and opened fire during a botched disarmament. Somewhere between 150 and 300 men, women, and children died in the snow. Sitting Bull's death and Wounded Knee are remembered as two halves of the same catastrophe, the violent end of organized Lakota resistance on the plains. The Army post surgeon who examined the body that night cut a lock of hair from his scalp and kept a pair of his leggings as personal souvenirs. He had no authorization to take either. In 1896, he loaned both items to the Smithsonian, where they were cataloged, filed, and left in storage, while the man's name became one of the most recognized in American history. For nearly a century, almost nobody at the museum seemed to know exactly what they had. The paperwork was thin. The provenance was murky. A war trophy, taken without consent from a body still warm, quietly absorbed into a bureaucratic filing system, as if the theft itself had been swallowed by time along with everything else about that night. Picture the accession ledger itself, a page of faded ink, a donor's name, a date, and almost nothing else. No note about consent, no note about the family, just an object logged like a coin or a fossil, sitting on a shelf while decades of visitors walked past exhibit halls 2 floors above, no idea what was quietly stored beneath their feet. It took a British anthropologist digging through old accession records in the 1990s to notice the reference and ask the obvious question nobody had bothered to ask in nearly 100 years. Who does this actually belong to? That single question triggered a repatriation investigation that would take more than a decade to untangle. The Smithsonian's own repatriation office, led by researcher Bill Billick, eventually confirmed what should have been apparent from the start: the surgeon had no legal or moral claim to any of it. Investigators tracked down the closest living relatives through birth records, death records, and family testimony. In 2007, the hair and the leggings were formally returned to Sitting Bull's descendants, more than a century after they were cut and stripped from his corpse. Most of the hair was burned in a private family ceremony not long after. That should have been the end of it. An object finally laid to rest, a wrong finally corrected, a story with a clean conclusion. It wasn't. a small sample had been kept back with the family's blessing, in case the science ever caught up to a question everyone quietly wanted answered, but nobody could yet prove. In 2021, it finally did. A team led by geneticist Esko Willerslev at the University of Cambridge had spent roughly 14 years developing a method capable of pulling usable genetic material out of hair that old and that degraded. The sample had been stored at room temperature for well over a century, likely treated with arsenic as a preservative, exactly the kind of handling that normally destroys any DNA worth testing. Most labs would have written it off as unusable. Willerslev's team built an entirely new probabilistic technique specifically to work around that damage. Instead of needing one long, intact strand, the method could work with dozens of short, broken fragments at once, weighing the statistical likelihood of a match rather than demanding a single clean read. They compared what they recovered to a DNA sample from Ernie LaPointe, a South Dakota man who had spent his entire life saying he was Sitting Bull's great-grandson, based on oral family history and a documented paper trail of birth and death records. Here's where the science gets specific, and it matters. Because the family line ran through LaPointe's mother, the two most common ancestry tools, Y chromosome testing, which only tracks father to son, and mitochondrial testing, which only tracks mother to child in a single, unbroken maternal line, couldn't settle the question on their own. Only autosomal DNA, the mixed genetic material inherited from both parents and reshuffled every generation, could confirm a great-grandfather relationship this far removed. It's messier to analyze, harder to extract from degraded material, and far more convincing when it actually works. Published that October in the journal Science Advances, the comparison matched. Willerslev would later describe the team as certain, not cautiously confident, but certain that the connection held. The story made headlines around the world within days, genetic science reaching across more than a century to confirm one family's history. But almost none of the coverage lingered on the deeper question the same test was about to raise. It was the first time ancient DNA had ever been used to confirm a family relationship between a living person and a named historical figure. That should have been a clean, satisfying ending to a 130-year-old story, a stolen relic, a wronged family, a scientific triumph, closing the loop with a bow on top. Except the same tool that had just proven exactly who belonged to whom was about to get pointed at a much bigger question. Not one man's bloodline, but an entire people's point of origin. And that question did not have a clean answer waiting for it. To understand why, you have to set the laboratory aside for a moment and go back to a story that has nothing to do with genetics. Long before anyone talked about autosomal DNA, the Lakota already had an explanation for where they came from, and it didn't involve a migration route or a carbon date. According to Lakota oral tradition, the people first lived in a world beneath this one. When the time came, they emerged into daylight through a narrow passage in the Black Hills, led by a figure called Tokahe, the first man, and the buffalo rose up with them, out of the same opening, into the same light. The site of that emergence is Wind Cave. In Lakota, it's sometimes called Washinia, the breathing cave, because air moves in and out of its entrance with enough force that early visitors swore the ground itself was inhaling. Two brothers, Jesse and Tom Bingham, are usually credited with finding that entrance in 1881 after hearing a strange whistling sound rising from a narrow hole in the prairie grass, wind rushing out of the earth hard enough, the story goes, to knock the hat clean off Tom's head. What settlers treated as a curiosity, the Lakota had already named and explained centuries earlier: the breath of the earth itself, moving air pushed by shifting barometric pressure deep underground. In 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt made the site the first cave in the world ever designated a national park. a quiet irony, a sacred emergence site formerly protected by the same federal government that had spent the previous decades trying to seize the land surrounding it. That's not folklore treated as decoration. It's a foundational claim about identity, and it still carries enormous legal and cultural weight. The Black Hills, Hisapa, Pahasapa, aren't just scenery to the Lakota. They're described as the center of the world, a sacred landscape studded with ceremonial sites. Wind Cave, Bear Butte, Devil's Tower, Black Elk Peak. Under the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, the hills were guaranteed to the Sioux as part of the Great Sioux Reservation. 6 years later, in 1874, Custer led an expedition straight into the hills and confirmed rumors of gold. Within 2 years, the treaty was broken and the land seized outright. In 1980, more than a century later, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians that the seizure had been illegal and ordered compensation. The tribes refused the money. It has sat untouched in a federal account for decades, now worth well over $1 billion, because what the Lakota have said they want back is the land itself, not a settlement check. The same hills carry the argument in stone too, whether visitors notice or not. Mount Rushmore was blasted out of granite the Lakota considers sacred, carved between 1927 and 1941 on land the Supreme Court would later rule had been stolen. A short drive away, the still unfinished Crazy Horse Memorial has been under construction since 1948, started by sculptor Korczak Ziolkowski at the invitation of a Lakota chief, meant as a counter-monument on the same contested ground. Ziolkowski is the same sculptor who, years earlier, made the bronze bust marking Sitting Bull's disputed grave near Mobridge. Millions of tourists photograph these hills every year without knowing they're standing in the middle of the exact dispute this story is built around. If there is one landscape in modern America built on the idea of an unbroken, sacred, ancient claim to a specific piece of ground, this is it. So here's the first real problem, and it comes from an unexpected place. If you ask exactly when the Lakota physically arrived in the Black Hills, not spiritually, but on the ground, as recorded by their own people, you get a specific answer, and it's recent. The Lakota kept their own historical records, called winter counts, pictographic calendars painted on hide, one small image per year, each image a memory device standing in for a single event significant enough to define that entire winter. One of the most detailed surviving examples belonged to a Sikangu Lakota man named Baptiste Good, born around 1821, later transcribed and recorded by an army surgeon named William Corbusier at the Rosebud Agency around 1879. It marks a specific winter, roughly 1765, as the year a Lakota party, led by a man called Standing Bear, first entered and discovered the Black Hills. It marks another winter, roughly 1776, as the year the Lakota defeated the Cheyenne who had been living there and took the region for themselves. Sit with that for a second. The same people whose oral tradition places their spiritual birth inside the Black Hills also kept a physical, hand-painted record, their own record made by their own historians, dating their arrival there to the same decade the United States was declaring independence, 3,000 kilometers away. That's not ancient, that's recent history, painted on hide by the people who lived it, sitting in open tension with the idea of a homeland the people had occupied since the beginning of time. The documentary Paper Trail backs it up from the other direction, too. Jesuit missionaries in the 1640s recorded Dakota bands living far to the east, near Sault Ste. Marie, deep in the Great Lakes region. French explorers in the 1670s and 80s found Dakota communities settled around Mille Lacs Lake in what's now Minnesota, hundreds of kilometers from the Black Hills. It's worth pausing on that because it complicates the story even further. The Eastern Dakota bands trace their own origin not to Wind Cave at all, but to Bedot, the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, and to the waters of Mille Lacs itself. Even within the Oceti-Sakowin, the larger confederation of Sioux nations, there isn't one single unified origin story. There are several, layered over each other, tied to different bands, different homelands, different centuries. Armed by French traders, rival Ojibwe fighters pushed the Dakota and Lakota bands steadily west out of that woodland territory through the fur trade wars of the 17th and 18th centuries. By the 1750s, Lakota bands were reaching the Missouri River in present-day South Dakota and colliding with the people already living there, the Arikara, established, fortified, and unwilling to simply hand over territory. Then came the detail that changed how fast that expansion could actually happen. Between 1772 and 1780, a smallpox epidemic tore through the Arikara, Mandan, and Hidatsa villages, strung along the Missouri, killing a staggering share of their populations in a matter of years. Entire villages emptied. Survivors abandoned fortified towns their families had held for generations and merged into a handful of smaller, weaker settlements just to survive. The Lakota, still largely outside the epidemic's path, crossed the river into land that had just been catastrophically cleared by a disease they hadn't caused and didn't share. Within a generation, they had pushed the Cheyenne out of the Black Hills entirely and become the dominant military power on the northern plains, a rise that looks, on the historical record, less like an eternal homeland story and more like a fast-moving, opportunistic expansion that happened to land permanently in one of the most spiritually significant places the Lakota would ever claim. None of that erases the emergent story at Wind Cave. But it does raise a question the museum brochure version of history tends to skip entirely. If the Lakota only physically reached the Black Hills in the 1760s, what or who was already there, buried in the ground, for the 1,000 years before that? 19th century observers like Edwin Denig and Richard Dodge even claimed the Lakota avoided parts of the hills out of what they called superstition, a claim later historians treat with real skepticism, since it conveniently served a government that wanted the land to look unclaimed and available. South Dakota's soil, it turns out, has been keeping its own records the entire time, and for the deepest layers of that record, they don't belong to the Sioux at all. In the summer of 1978, near the town of Chamberlain, erosion along a riverbank exposed something that made a local official call in archaeologists instead of a forensics team. Bones, a lot of them, tangled together at the eroding end of a defensive ditch. For years before that, looters and pot hunters had already picked through parts of the site undocumented, scattering artifacts and almost certainly human remains along with them. Nobody had studied the place systematically until the erosion forced the question. What researchers found, once the site was properly excavated under archaeologist Larry Zimmerman, was staggering. The remains of at least 486 people, packed into the end of a ditch that once encircled a fortified village. Skulls showed clear scalping marks. Bodies had been mutilated, some decapitated, dumped in a mass grave in the aftermath of what was almost certainly a single, overwhelming attack. A later osteological study, conducted by researcher P. Willey, confirmed the trauma pattern across the skeletal population. Radiocarbon dating and archaeological context placed the massacre around 1325, roughly 440 years before any Lakota band ever set foot in the region. This is the Crow Creek Massacre site, and here's the detail that should stop you cold. The people slaughtered there weren't killed by outside invaders sweeping in from some distant civilization. They were native people, killed by other native people, in a conflict archaeologists link to the ancestors of the Arikara, a fortified farming society that had built earthen lodges, dug defensive ditches, and organized itself for serious, coordinated warfare against rivals, centuries before Europeans reached the plains, and centuries before the Sioux arrived to claim any of this ground. The remains were reburied in 1981 after consultation with tribal representatives, an early, influential moment in what would eventually harden into federal repatriation law. The Crow Creek Sioux tribe asserted cultural affiliation and buried the dead on their own land, treating them as ancestors worth protecting and honoring. That's not wrong, but it is strange if you actually sit with it. Bones connected by archaeologists to a rival people the Sioux hadn't even arrived to displace yet are now resting under Sioux stewardship on Sioux land, protected by Sioux hands generations later, whose history is actually being honored there. The archaeology and the modern ceremony are answering two different questions, and neither one is lying. Crow Creek isn't an isolated case. Head northeast to Lake Mitchell, and you'll find one of the only active public archaeological excavations in the entire state, a fortified village dating back roughly 1,000 years, now protected under a climate-controlled glass dome called the Thompson Center Archaeodome. Around 600 people once lived there, inside earth lodges, ringed by a defensive palisade and ditch, farming corn, beans, and squash, trading with cultures as far away as Cahokia in Illinois. Field crews from Augustana University, working seasons alongside researchers from the University of Exeter, have pulled carbonized corn cobs out of the earth there, sealed cache pits capped with clay and ash, even a shell fragment carved into the shape of a bird, evidence of a 1,000-year-old society that was sophisticated, organized, and thoroughly agricultural. The people who built it are considered ancestral to the Mandan, not the Sioux. South, along the Big Sioux River, straddling the border with Iowa, sits Blood Run, the largest Oneota archaeological site in the entire Midwest, occupied for roughly 400 years, from the 1300s into the 1600s, right up until European contact reshaped everything. Blood Run is considered ancestral to the Omaha, the Ponca, the Iowa, and the Odawa Missouri. Again, not the Sioux. And further north, along the Missouri, sites like Double Ditch record the other side of the same expansion. When William Clark passed through in October of 1804, he noted in his journal that one of the Mandan villages there had already been, in his own words, entirely cut off by the Sioux, a fortified farming town wiped from the map decades after the Lakota crossed the river. Do you see the pattern forming? Every major pre-contact archaeological site of real significance in South Dakota, Crow Creek, Mitchell, Blood Run, Double Ditch, points to a different people entirely. Not one of them is Lakota. The oldest, deepest, most sophisticated physical evidence of ancient life on that land belongs to the very peoples the Lakota later pushed aside on their way to becoming the dominant power in the region. It's a contradiction the state itself profits from without fully reconciling. Drive through the Black Hills, and roadside markers celebrate Mount Rushmore and the sacred landscape rising behind it. Drive a few hours east, and different markers at Mitchell and at Blood Run quietly credit entirely different peoples with the oldest chapters of South Dakota's story. Both sets of markers are accurate. Almost nobody reads them side by side. Which brings the DNA test full circle, because if the ground itself won't confirm an ancient Sioux presence, maybe the language will. Linguists have spent decades reconstructing Proto-Siouan, the ancestral language behind Lakota, Dakota, and an entire family of related tongues, by comparing surviving vocabulary and grammar across dozens of descendant languages, the same way biologists reconstruct an evolutionary tree from fragments of shared DNA. That reconstruction, built out over generations by specialists, including linguist Robert Rankin and the team behind the Comparative Siouan Dictionary Project, doesn't point to South Dakota at all. It points east to the Ohio River Valley with the major branches of the Sioux language family splitting apart somewhere around 500 to 200 years before the Common Era, more than 2,000 years before Standing Bear's party ever laid eyes on the Black Hills. Put the pieces next to each other, and the accepted story doesn't just wobble, it restructures. A sacred origin story rooted in the Black Hills, a physical migration that the Lakota's own winter counts date to the 1760s, ancient sites across South Dakota that belong, provably, to other peoples entirely, a language tree with its deepest roots 1,000 miles to the east. None of that is fabricated. All of it comes from primary sources, winter counts painted by Lakota hands, linguistic reconstructions built by specialists over decades, human remains excavated and dated under careful scientific supervision. And none of it, on its own, destroys the Wind Cave story. But together, it makes the simple version, the Lakota have always been here, much harder to defend without a serious asterisk attached. This is exactly the kind of collision that split serious scholars for decades, and it never fully resolved. Vine Deloria Jr., the Standing Rock Sioux scholar, author of Custer Died for Your Sins, and one of the most influential Native intellectuals of the 20th century, rejected the entire framework mainstream science was using. The idea that every Native people arrived via a land bridge from Siberia, that oral tradition was folklore to be politely explained away by real archaeology. In his 1995 book Red Earth, White Lies, he argued that a people's own account of where they came from deserved to be treated as evidence, not decoration, and that ranking it beneath a radiocarbon date was its own quiet form of erasure. Archaeologists and geneticists pushed back hard, pointing to genetic evidence like the Anzac genome, a 12,700-year-old Clovis infant excavated in Montana and sequenced by the very same Cambridge-linked research network that would later test Sitting Bull's hair, as strong support for the deep, ancient migration story most scientists accept. The debate never fully resolved. It's still being fought, quietly, in journals and tribal council meetings, decades after Deloria first raised it, by scholars like historian Jeffrey Ostler and archaeologist Linnea Sundstrom, both of whom have spent years trying to hold the sacred claim and the historical record in the same hand without letting either one collapse. So which version is true? That might be the wrong question to ask. What the evidence actually supports is stranger and more interesting than a simple yes or no. The Lakota's spiritual claim to the Black Hills and the archaeological record of a recent, violent arrival aren't necessarily lying to each other. They might be answering two different questions. One is about where the people's bodies physically traveled from, generation by generation, migration by migration. The other is about where their identity as a people was forged, tested, and made permanent through catastrophe, conquest, ceremony, and 2.5 centuries of survival on that exact ground. Science was built to measure the first question. It was never built to measure the second. And that is precisely where the old, comfortable version of the story stops being enough. The consequences of all this didn't stay locked inside academic journals. They're still playing out today in real institutions, with real legal stakes attached. In April of 2014, the FBI raided a farm in Indiana belonging to a private collector named Don Miller, who had spent roughly 60 years quietly amassing artifacts from all over the world. What agents found stunned even veteran investigators. More than 42,000 objects, among them roughly 2,000 human bones, representing an estimated 500 individual people. FBI Special Agent Tim Carpenter of the Bureau's art crime team later described the recovery in blunt terms: about 2,000 bones representing about 500 human beings. Records showed more than half of those ancestors had been taken from South Dakota alone. It remains, by the FBI's own description, the largest single recovery of cultural property in the Bureau's history. It took years to sort through, identify, and coordinate a proper return. On November 11th, 2022, 274 ancestors were formally repatriated to South Dakota tribes, alongside more than 400 cultural items, in a process that required, according to the anthropologist who served as custodian of the collection, bringing together every tribe that considers that land its ancestral homeland. The reburial locations were kept confidential, a small, final act of protection for people who had already been dug up, cataloged, and stored on shelves for decades. Even now, the state's own historical society continues filing federal repatriation notices for remains still sitting in institutional storage, and universities elsewhere keep discovering more. The University of North Dakota uncovered ancestral remains and cultural items in its own collections in 2022 and 2023, notified nearly 50 tribal nations, and brought on citizens of affected tribes to help guide the return. The paperwork trail alone, decades deep, tells its own quiet story about how much of this was simply never dealt with the first time around. And the search for what's been buried and what's been quietly hidden hasn't stopped. In 2022, a ground-penetrating radar specialist named Marcia Small scanned the grounds of the former Holy Rosary Mission, now Red Cloud Indian School on the Pine Ridge Reservation. She later excavated a basement there, saying flatly that she was treating the site like a crime scene. In May of 2025, a memorial was dedicated in Rapid City for more than 50 children who died while attending the former Rapid City Indian boarding school, deaths documented through years of archival digging, ground-penetrating radar, and oral history from families who never stopped asking where their children had actually gone. The memorial includes a bronze sculpture at its surface, set with 50 small stars, one for each child whose death has now been formally confirmed. Every one of those unmarked graves is its own small version of the same fight, a record that existed all along, quietly, waiting for someone with the right tools and the right motivation to go looking for it. Then there's Ernie LaPointe himself, the man whose DNA started this entire chain, still fighting a battle that has nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with dignity. Sitting Bull's remains, or what's believed to be his remains, were moved in 1953 to a bluff near Mobridge, South Dakota, sealed under a slab of concrete and marked with that bronze bust by Korczak Zielkowski. LaPointe doesn't believe that site holds any real connection to his great-grandfather, and some researchers have quietly questioned whether the original 1953 disinterment even recovered the correct remains from the correct grave, a dispute that has never been settled either way. He's pushed for years to have the remains relocated, possibly to the site of the Little Bighorn battlefield itself, and the argument remains unresolved as of this year. Under U.S. law, as Sitting Bull's confirmed closest living descendant, LaPointe now legally owns the rights to his ancestors' genetic data, a strange, modern kind of inheritance nobody standing over that body in 1890 could possibly have imagined. A man's bloodline, sequenced, cataloged, and legally owned more than a century after strangers took a piece of his body without asking permission from anyone. That is really what this entire chain of evidence keeps circling back to. Not whether the Lakota belong in the Black Hills, because they clearly do, spiritually, legally, and by right of 2.5 centuries of blood spent defending it. The harder question is, who gets to decide what counts as belonging in the first place? The elder holding the oral tradition, the linguist holding the reconstructed word list, the archaeologist holding the carbon date, or the family holding the DNA report. Every one of them is holding a real piece of the same truth. None of them is holding all of it. Walk all of that back to where it started, and the shape of it becomes impossible to ignore. A stolen lock of hair, a forgotten shelf, a DNA match that was supposed to be a simple, satisfying confirmation of identity, and instead became the thread that unraveled a much larger, much older argument about who was really first to stand on that ground and what belonging even means once science learns how to check. Crow Creek's dead still rest under Sioux protection, even though the archaeology says, plainly, they weren't Sioux at all. Winter counts still name the exact year the Black Hills changed hands, in a story most people assume has no beginning. A carved granite mountain and its unfinished granite neighbor still stare at each other across the same disputed ridgeline. And 1,000 miles to the east, a reconstructed language tree with roots older than most of what we call ancient history still insists, quietly, that this particular story started somewhere else entirely. The glass case at the Smithsonian is empty now. The hair that once sat inside it was burned years ago, in a ceremony meant to finally let Sitting Bull rest. But the case itself is still there, cleaned, cataloged, sitting on a numbered shelf in a storage room almost nobody ever sees. An empty container that once held the physical proof of exactly who a man was, and almost by accident, the first thread pulled in a much bigger argument about where an entire people actually came from. Meanwhile, in Mitchell, South Dakota, under a quiet dome of glass and steel, someone is still on their knees in the dirt, brushing dust off a 1,000-year-old fire pit that belongs to nobody currently alive to claim it, waiting, like everything else in the story, for someone to finally decide who gets to say what it means